His fingers traced the edge of my skirt, barely grazing the fabric, but the heat of his touch sent electricity shooting through every nerve in my body. The music from the office party pulsed around us, but all I could focus on was the way his breath felt against my ear, the deliberate slowness of his movement as his hand found its way higher. "We shouldn't be doing this here," I whispered, even as my body betrayed me, leaning into his warmth. His lips curved into that knowing smile I'd been trying to ignore for months. "Then tell me to stop," he murmured, his voice low and rough. I opened my mouth to say the words, but they never came. Instead, I felt my resolve crumbling as his touch grew bolder, more certain, claiming something I didn't even know I'd been offering. The holiday party was supposed to be harmless, just colleagues celebrating another year, nothing more. But the moment Caleb pulled me onto the makeshift dance floor, his hands settling possessively on my waist, I knew this night would change everything. The champagne had made me bold, or maybe it was the way he'd been watching me all evening, like he was seeing something in me that I kept hidden beneath professional smiles and careful boundaries. His chest pressed against mine as we swayed to the music, and when his fingers began their slow exploration along my thigh, I should have stepped away. Instead, I found myself moving closer, my breath catching as anticipation coiled tight in my stomach. Hey, loving this story already? Hit that like button and subscribe. I promise it's worth sticking around for what happens next. The corporate holiday party at Meridian Analytics was in full swing, the usual sterile conference room transformed with twinkling lights and a bar that had already loosened more tongues than mine. I nursed my second glass of champagne, watching. My colleagues shed their professional facades one drink at a time. Sarah from accounting was attempting what she probably thought was seductive dancing with the IT guy, while our normally buttoned-up manager was telling increasingly inappropriate jokes by the punch bowl. I should have felt relaxed, part of the celebration, but instead I found myself hyper-aware of every movement in the room, specifically the movements of one person. Caleb Matthews had been my desk neighbor for 8 months, close enough that I knew he preferred his coffee black and took calls standing up, pacing in tight circles that sometimes brought him dangerously close to my workspace. Tonight, though, he wasn't pacing. He was watching me with an intensity that made my skin feel too tight, too warm. "You look like you're plotting an escape." His voice came from directly behind me, sending a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I turned to find him closer than expected, close enough to catch the scent of his cologne mixed with something distinctly him. "Just observing the native ritual of office parties," I replied, aiming for casual but hearing the slight breathiness in my own voice. His eyes, darker than usual in the dim lighting, traveled from my face down to the black dress I'd chosen. Professional, enough for work, but with just enough curve to make me feel confident. "You're missing the best part," he said, extending his hand. "The part where you actually participate." I stared at his outstretched palm, knowing that taking it would cross a line we'd been carefully maintaining for months. The flirtation between us had been subtle, professional, lingering glances during meetings, fingers brushing when passing documents, conversations that lasted longer than necessary. But this felt different. This felt like a choice that would change everything. The music shifted to something slower, more intimate, and I watched couples around us pull each other closer. Before I could overthink it, I placed my hand in his. The contact sent heat racing up my arm, and from the way his grip tightened slightly, I knew he felt it too. He led me to a corner of the improvised dance floor, where the lights were dimmer, where we could move without bumping into our swaying colleagues. His hands settled on my waist, respectful at first, but even that simple touch made my breath catch. I placed my hands on his shoulders, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath the fabric of his shirt. "I've been wanting to do this for a long time," he admitted, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "Dance?" I asked, though we both knew that wasn't what he meant. "Be close to you," he corrected, and the honesty in his voice made something flutter deep in my chest. We swayed together, the pretense of dancing giving us permission to touch, to be near each other in a way that would have been impossible in our sterile office environment. His thumbs traced small circles against my waist, such a simple gesture that shouldn't have affected me so much, but every nerve ending seemed to be focused on those points of contact. The song played on, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, the space between us disappeared. His chest pressed against mine, solid and warm, and I could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. When I looked up, his eyes were already on mine, dark and intent, asking a question I wasn't sure I was ready to answer. That's when his hand moved. Slowly, deliberately, his fingers trailed from my waist down to my hip, then lower, skimming along the edge of my skirt. The touch was light, teasing, but it sent electricity shooting through me. I should have stepped back, should have maintained the professional distance we'd worked so hard to preserve, but instead I found myself pressing closer. "Zoe," He said my name like a prayer, his breath warm against my ear. His hand grew bolder, fingers tracing patterns along my thigh that made my knees weak. The music, the chatter of our colleagues, the entire party faded into background noise. All that existed was the heat of his touch and the way my body was responding to it. His fingers found the hem of my skirt and slipped beneath it, just barely, his touch feather-light against my skin. I gasped softly, my hands tightening on his shoulders. "Caleb," I whispered, not sure if I was protesting or encouraging. "Tell me to stop," he said again, but his touch grew more confident, more deliberate, his fingers exploring the sensitive skin of my inner thigh. I opened my mouth to say the words, to be sensible, to remember where we were, but coherent thoughts seemed impossible when his touch was setting my entire body on fire. Instead of pulling away, I found myself melting against him, my head falling back as sensation overwhelmed me. His other hand moved to support me, pressing against the small of my back, holding me steady as his fingers continued their maddening exploration. The music seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat, and I was vaguely aware that we were still moving, still maintaining the pretense of dancing, even as something far more intimate was happening between us. "Not here," I finally managed to whisper, though whether I was asking him to stop or suggesting we move somewhere more private, I wasn't entirely sure. His hand stilled, and for a moment I thought he might pull away, might return us to safe, professional ground. Instead, he leaned closer, his lips brushing against my ear. "Conference room B," he murmured. 5 minutes. The suggestion hung in the air between us, loaded with possibility and danger. Conference room B was just down the hall, away from the party, private. If I went there, if I met him, there would be no pretending this was innocent flirtation anymore. Nodded, not trusting my voice, and felt him smile against my ear before he pulled back. His hand slipped away from beneath my skirt, leaving me feeling oddly bereft, cold where his warmth had been. He stepped back, putting professional distance between us once again, but the heat in his eyes remained. 5 minutes, he repeated, then turned and walked away, stopping to chat casually with a group from marketing as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just set my entire world on fire with his touch. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, trying to think clearly. This was insane. We worked together. Office relationships were complicated, messy, potentially career-ending if things went wrong. I should go home, pretend this never happened, return to our careful professional dance on Monday morning, but my body was still humming from his touch, and the memory of his fingers on my skin made it impossible to think rationally. I made my way to the ladies' room, needing a moment to compose myself, to look in the mirror and decide what I really wanted. My reflection stared back at me, flushed cheeks, bright eyes, lips slightly parted. I looked like a woman on the edge of making a very dangerous decision. I splashed cool water on my wrists, trying to calm my racing pulse, but it was useless. Every cell in my body was calling out for more of his touch, more of the electricity that sparked between us. The 5 minutes felt like an eternity and an instant, all at once. Before I could talk myself out of it, I found myself walking down the hallway, my heels clicking softly on the polished floor. The sounds of the party grew fainter with each step, until all I could hear was my own heartbeat and the whisper of my dress against my legs. Conference room B was dark, illuminated, only by the city lights streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. For a moment, I thought maybe he hadn't come. Maybe he'd thought better of this dangerous game we were playing. Then I saw him, silhouetted against the window, hands in his pockets, waiting. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said softly, not turning. "Around?" "I wasn't sure either," I admitted, stepping into the room and closing the door behind me. The soft click of the latch seemed to echo in the silence. He turned then, and even in the dim light I could see the intensity in his expression. "We don't have to do anything you don't want to do," he said. But there was a question in his voice, a hope that made my stomach flutter. Instead of answering, with words I moved toward him, closing the distance between us. His hands came up to frame my face, thumbs brushing over my cheekbones as he searched my eyes. Whatever he saw there must have satisfied him, because his mouth came down to mine in a kiss that was nothing like the careful, professional relationship we'd maintained for months. This kiss was fire and need and months of suppressed attraction, finally given permission to burn. His lips moved against mine with a hunger that matched my own, and I found myself pressing closer, my hands fisting in his shirt as if I could pull him into me completely. He backed me against the conference table, his hands roaming over my body with a confidence that made me weak. The kiss deepened, became more desperate, and I could taste the champagne on his lips, could feel the rapid beat of his heart against my chest. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against mine. "I've wanted this for so long," he whispered, his hands still framing my face. "Wanted you." "Me too." I breathed, surprised by my own boldness. But it was true. Beneath all the professional courtesy and careful boundaries, I'd been wanting this, wanting him, for months. His hands moved to my waist, lifting me easily onto the edge of the conference table. The cool surface against the back of my thighs made me gasp, but then his mouth was on mine again, and nothing else mattered. His hands were everywhere, tracing the neckline of my dress, skimming along my sides, tangling in my hair. I pulled at his shirt, wanting to feel his skin, needing. The barrier of fabric gone. He helped me, shrugging out of his jacket and pulling his shirt over his head in one fluid motion. The city lights painted silver patterns across his chest, and I couldn't resist reaching out to trace them with my fingers. He groaned at the touch, his hands tightening on my waist. "Zoe?" He said my name like a prayer again, and I loved the way it sounded on his lips, rough with desire. His mouth found my neck, placing soft kisses along the column of my throat that made me arch against him. His hands slipped to the back of my dress, finding the zipper, pausing. "Is this okay?" he asked, and I loved him a little bit for asking, for making sure even in the heat of the moment. "Yes," I whispered, and felt the cool air against my skin as he slowly lowered the zipper. The dress slipped from my shoulders, pooling around my waist, and his intake of breath was audible in the quiet room. "Beautiful," he murmured, his hands reverent as they explored newly exposed skin. His touch was like electricity, making me gasp and arch against him, wanting more, needing more. The conference table was the perfect height, allowing him to step between my legs, to pull me close against him. The heat of his skin against mine was intoxicating, and when his mouth found mine again, I thought I might dissolve from the intensity of it all. His hands were skilled, knowing exactly how to touch me to make me gasp, to make my head fall back, in pleasure. He took his time, building the tension between us until I was trembling with need, my fingers digging into his shoulders. "Please," I whispered, not even sure what I was asking for, just knowing I needed more of him, all of him. He understood, his movements becoming more urgent, more focused. The world outside the conference room ceased to exist. There was only us, only this moment, only the incredible sensation of finally giving in to what we'd both wanted for so long. When pleasure crashed over me like a wave, I buried my face against his shoulder to muffle my cry, my body shaking with the intensity of it. He followed moments later, his own release making him groan my name against my hair, his arms tight around me as if he never wanted to let me go. We stayed like that for long minutes, holding each other as our breathing slowly returned to normal. The reality of what we'd just done began to creep in around the edges of my consciousness, but I pushed it away, not ready to deal with complications yet. "That was," he started, then trailed off, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my back. "Yeah," I agreed, knowing exactly what he meant. There weren't words for what had just happened between us. Eventually, we had to separate, had to make ourselves presentable again. He helped me with my zipper, his fingers gentle against my skin, and I helped him straighten his shirt. We moved around each other carefully, like we were both afraid that speaking might break whatever spell had been cast over us. "We should get back," I said finally, though the last thing I wanted was to return to the party, to pretend that nothing had changed. He nodded, but caught my hand as I moved toward the door. "Zoe," he said, and something in his voice made me turn back. "This isn't just... I don't want this to be a one-time thing." The hope in his eyes made my heart race all over again. I wanted to tell him I felt the same way, that I wanted to explore whatever this was between us, but the practical part of my brain was already cataloging all the reasons why this was complicated. "I know," I said instead, squeezing his hand. "We'll figure it out." He smiled then, that slow, devastating smile that had been getting me into trouble for months. "Monday's going to be interesting," he said. I laughed, some of the tension breaking. That's one word for it. We left the conference room separately, him first, and then me a few minutes later. By the time I rejoined the party, most people were too drunk to notice I'd been gone, and Caleb was across the room talking to someone from HR, looking perfectly composed. But when our eyes met across the crowded room, the heat in his gaze told me that Monday was going to be very interesting. Indeed, the rest of the party passed in a blur. I made small talk, laughed at jokes, played the part of the professional colleague, but all I could think about was the feeling of Caleb's hands on my skin, the way he'd said my name like it was something precious. Every time I caught sight of him across the room, my body remembered his touch, and I had to fight to keep my expression neutral. When the party finally wound down, I gathered my coat and purse, ready to escape to the safety of my apartment where I could process what had happened. But as I waited for the elevator, I felt him behind me again, that same electric awareness that had started everything. "Let me walk you to your car," he said quietly, and I nodded, not trusting my voice. The parking garage was dimly lit and nearly empty, our footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. When we reached my car, I turned to say goodnight, but the words died on my lips at the intensity in his expression. "I meant what I said in there," he told me, stepping closer. "This isn't over." "Caleb," I started, but he cut me off with a gentle finger against my lips. "I know it's complicated," he said. "I know we work together, that there are risks, but I also know I've never felt anything like what I felt with you tonight, have you?" I shook my head, unable to lie. What had happened between us was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Raw, powerful, consuming in a way that both thrilled and terrified me. "Then we'll be careful," he said, his thumb tracing along my jawline. "We'll figure out how to make this work." Before I could respond, he kissed me again, soft and sweet this time, full of promise rather than desperate need. When he pulled back, I was breathless all over again. "Good night, Zoe," he whispered. And then he was walking away, leaving me standing beside my car with my heart racing and my mind spinning. The drive home passed in a haze of sensation and memory. My body still hummed with the aftermath of his touch, and I caught myself touching my lips, remembering the feel of his mouth on mine. By the time I reached my apartment, I was already replaying every moment, every sensation, storing them away like precious secrets. I poured myself a glass of wine and curled up on my couch, staring out at the city lights and trying to make sense of what had happened. In the space of a few hours, everything had changed. The careful professional relationship I'd maintained with Caleb was shattered, replaced by something intense and complicated and absolutely terrifying. Part of me wanted to panic, to start planning how to minimize the damage, how to keep this from affecting our work. But a larger part, the part that was still tingling from his touch, wanted to embrace whatever this was, to see where it might lead. My phone buzzed with a text message, and my heart jumped when I saw his name on the screen. "Sweet dreams, beautiful, looking forward to Monday." I smiled, warmth spreading through my chest as I typed back, "Me too." And despite all the complications, all the potential problems, I realized I meant it. Monday couldn't come soon enough. The weekend passed slowly, filled with thoughts of Caleb and what Monday would bring. I found myself checking my phone constantly, hoping for another message from him, but also nervous about what we'd say to each other. How did you go back to professional colleagues after what we'd shared? Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching my nervous energy. I dressed carefully, choosing a conservative blouse and skirt that I hoped struck the right balance between professional and attractive. The elevator ride to our floor seemed to take forever, and my hands were actually shaking as I walked toward my desk. Caleb was already there, coffee in hand, looking perfectly composed in a dark suit that made my mouth go dry. When he looked up and saw me, that slow smile spread across his face, and all my nervous energy transformed into something much more dangerous. "Good morning, Zoe," he said, his voice perfectly professional, but with an undertone that made me remember exactly how he'd whispered my name Friday night. "Good morning," I managed, settling at my desk and trying to focus on my computer screen. But I was hyper-aware of his every movement, the sound of his voice when he took phone calls, the way he drummed his fingers on his desk when he was thinking. Around mid-morning, he appeared at my desk with a stack of files. "Could you review these for me?" he asked, his fingers brushing mine as he handed them over. The brief contact sent electricity shooting up my arm, and from the way his eyes darkened, I knew he felt it too. "Of course," I said, my voice slightly breathless. "Thanks," he replied, then leaned down as if to point out something in the files. Instead, his mouth was suddenly close to my ear, his breath warm against my skin. "You look beautiful today," he whispered, so quietly that no one else could possibly hear. I shivered, my fingers tightening on the files. "Caleb," I breathed, a warning and a plea all at once. He straightened up, his expression perfectly professional, again, but I caught the satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Let me know if you have any questions about those reports," he said in his normal voice, then walked back to his desk as if nothing had happened. I spent the rest of the morning trying to concentrate on work, but it was impossible with him so close, with the memory of his whispered words making my skin feel too warm. Every time someone walked by our desks, I was terrified they'd notice the tension crackling between us, but everyone seemed oblivious to the undercurrents. Lunch couldn't come fast enough. I was gathering my purse when my phone buzzed with a text. From Caleb. "Stairwell, now." My heart jumped into my throat. The stairwell was private, away from prying eyes and curious colleagues. I shouldn't go. This was exactly the kind of risk we needed to avoid if we wanted to keep our jobs and our reputations intact. But I found myself walking toward the stairwell anyway, drawn by the same magnetic pull that had led me to that conference room Friday night. He was waiting on the landing between floors, and the moment I appeared, he reached for me, pulling me into his arms and capturing my mouth in a kiss that was hungry and desperate, and everything I'd been craving all morning. I couldn't concentrate. he murmured against my lips. All I could think about was touching you again. This is crazy, I whispered, even as my hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer. Anyone could see us. I know, he said, his mouth moving to my neck, placing soft kisses that made me gasp. But I can't seem to care. His hands were roaming over my body again, reacquainting themselves with curves they'd mapped so thoroughly. Friday night. When his fingers found the buttons of my blouse, I should have stopped him, should have reminded him where we were, but instead I arched against him, wanting more. We can't, I said weakly, even as my body betrayed me, responding to his touch with an eagerness that made thinking impossible. I know, he repeated, but his hands didn't stop their exploration. He'd managed to slip several buttons free, and when his palm cupped me through the thin fabric of my bra, I had to bite my lip to keep from moaning out loud. Tonight, he said urgently against my ear. Come home with me tonight. The invitation hung in the air between us, loaded with promise and danger. Going home with him would make this real, would take it beyond stolen moments in empty conference, rooms and stairwells. It would mean crossing a line there might be no coming back from. But as his thumb traced over sensitive skin and his mouth worked magic on my neck, I found myself nodding. Yes, I whispered, the word torn from somewhere deep in my chest. He pulled back to look at me, his eyes dark with satisfaction, and something deeper, more intense. Yes? He asked, as if he couldn't quite believe it. Yes, I repeated, more firmly, this time. His smile was brilliant, transforming his entire face. He kissed me again, soft and sweet this time, full of promise. 7 o'clock, he said. I'll text you my address. Then he was straightening my blouse, smoothing my hair, helping me look presentable again. You're beautiful when you're breathless, he murmured, and I blushed, suddenly aware of how I must look, lips swollen from his kisses, eyes bright with desire. We returned to our desks separately, but the rest of the day passed in a haze of anticipation. I caught him watching me several times, his gaze intense and possessive in a way that made heat pool low in my belly. When my phone buzzed with his address, I saved it immediately, my heart racing at the thought of what the evening might bring. The afternoon dragged by with agonizing slowness. I tried to focus on spreadsheets and reports, but my mind kept wandering to thoughts of Caleb, to memories of his hands on my skin, and the promise in his voice when he'd asked me to come home with him. By the time 5 o'clock arrived, I was practically vibrating with nervous energy. I touched up my makeup in the ladies' room, changed into the dress I'd brought specifically for this purpose, something that walked the line between elegant and seductive. When I emerged, Caleb was waiting by the elevators, and the heat in his eyes when he saw me made my knees weak. Ready? He asked, his voice rough with barely contained desire. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and followed him into the elevator. The ride down seemed to take forever, the silence between us charged with anticipation. When the doors finally opened, he placed his hand on the small of my back, guiding me toward the parking garage, and even that simple touch sent electricity racing through me. Follow me, he said when we reached our cars, and I nodded again, climbing into my vehicle with hands that weren't quite steady. The drive to his apartment was a blur of city lights and racing thoughts. By the time I pulled into the visitor parking space he'd directed me to, my heart was pounding so hard I was sure he'd be able to hear it. But when he met me at my car, when he took my hand and led me toward his building, all my nerves transformed into something much more powerful. Desire, pure and simple. The elevator ride to his floor was torture, the small space making me hyper-aware of his presence, of the heat radiating from his body, of the way he kept glancing at me like he wanted to devour me right then and there. When the doors finally opened, he led me down the hallway to his apartment, his fingers intertwined with mine. His apartment was exactly what I'd expected. Masculine, clean, sophisticated without being showy. But I barely had time to take in the details before he was pulling me into his arms, his mouth finding mine in a kiss that was everything I'd been craving all day. I've been thinking about this all afternoon, he murmured against my lips, his hands already working at the zipper of my dress. Me too, I confessed, my own fingers busy with the buttons of his shirt. This time, there was no urgency, no fear, of discovery. We had all night, and Caleb seemed determined to make the most of it. He undressed me slowly, reverently, his mouth following the path of his hands as he revealed inch after inch of skin. By the time he lifted me in his arms and carried me to his bedroom, I was trembling with need. What followed was a night of passion unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Caleb was an attentive lover, patient and skilled, taking the time to learn what made me gasp, what made me arch against him, what made me cry out his name. He worshipped my body with his hands and mouth, building the tension between us until I thought I might shatter from the intensity of it. When he finally made us one, moving inside me with a rhythm that felt like coming home, I understood that this was more than just physical attraction. What we had was deeper, more meaningful, and infinitely more dangerous because of it. Afterwards, we lay tangled together in his sheets, my head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. His fingers traced lazy patterns on my bare shoulder, and I felt more content than I had in years. "No regrets?" he asked quietly, and I could hear the vulnerability in his voice. I lifted my head to look at him, taking in his disheveled hair and the tender expression in his eyes. "None," I said firmly, and meant it. Whatever complications this might bring, whatever risks we were taking, I couldn't regret something that felt so right. He smiled, the tension leaving his body. "Good," he said, pulling me up for a gentle kiss. "Because I'm not letting you go." As I settled back against his chest, listening to the rain against his windows, I knew that everything had changed. We'd crossed a line we could never uncross, started something we'd have to be incredibly careful to protect. But lying there in his arms, feeling more complete than I had in years, I couldn't bring myself to worry about the future. Some secrets are worth the risk, don't you think? When desire becomes too strong to ignore, would you take the chance, even knowing it could change everything? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one and love hearing your thoughts. And if this story left you wanting more, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and turn on notifications because trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Until then, sweet dreams.